The Seattle night was a blur of neon and rain as I, Emma, 19, stumbled into our house past 1 a.m., my boots slipping on the hardwood, head spinning from a party where the bass was loud and the drinks were louder. I'd lost my ride, my phone half dead, and the buzz was fading into a reckless itch. Mom was off on a sales conference, leaving us for 2 weeks. Her last call a sharp bet I'd stay out of trouble, way off. My stepdad, Brock, a 58-year-old ex-casino dealer now consulting on security, had a gambler's edge, his sly glances and rough charm pulling me in ways I hadn't named. I'd caught his eyes lingering at breakfast, and tonight, drunk and bold, I was ready to play. I tripped into the kitchen, giggling, my denim skirt and loose top shifting, and found Brock at the counter, nursing a whiskey under a dim light, his faded flannel open over a tight tee, gray stubble sharp. He looked up, smirking, saying I looked like a bad hand, I bet I'd fold before dawn. I grinned, flirty, swayed closer, my elbow grazing his arm, teasing he'd no bad hands, bet he'd deal me anyway. He sipped, his fingers brushing the glass, muttering dealing was my dodge, bet I'd bluff first. I laughed, bumped his shoulder, saying bluffing was my spark, bet he'd call it quick. I plopped onto a stool, wobbling, flirty, saying he'd run tables, bet he'd play truth or dare with me. He smirked, poured me a splash of whiskey, his hand brushing mine, saying dares weren't my game, bet I'd choke on it. I chose dare, slurring, and he grinned, saying fix my collar, bet I'd fumble. I stood, swaying, my fingers brushing his neck as I tugged the fabric, his skin warm, his hand grazing my wrist, lingering, muttering I was trouble, bet I'd bust his deck. My pulse jumped, heat rising, and I leaned in, flirty, saying trouble was my bet he'd raise it high. He smirked, his fingers brushing my shoulder as he grabbed another glass, teasing I'd need it, I bet I'd spill it. I took a sip, my hand grazing his flirty, saying spilling was my vibe, bet he'd drink it up. The whiskey burned, and I swayed, my knee brushing his thigh, teasing he looked too good sipping, bet he'd stake a wild night. He clinked his glass to mine, his elbow brushing my arm, muttering staking was my trap, bet I'd drag him down. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying dragging was my rush, bet he'd ante up. The stool wobbled, and I slipped, tumbling forward with a yelp, my hands flailing. Brock lunged, catching my waist, his arms firm, pulling me upright, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd cost him a bottle. My heart raced, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying costing was my thrill, bet he'd save it anyway. He steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing that saving was my snare, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, bumped his chest, flirty, saying hooking was my win, bet he'd call it sharp. The kitchen pulsed, the bulb flickering, and I stayed close, sipping, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I dared. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the counter, muttering flaring was my chaos, bet I'd burn this place. I leaned in, my shoulder grazing his flirty, saying burning was my rush, bet he'd fan it anyway. He smirked, poured another splash, his arm brushing my side, muttering fanning was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying blazing was my bet he'd bite it hard. The night ticked on, the city quiet outside, and I stood, swaying, saying he was too slick, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, leaned closer, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering chasing was my trap, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his hip one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd play it all. The tension hummed, whiskey low, and I knew I'd hooked him, kitchen warm, stakes wild. 2 days after the whiskey-soaked dare in the kitchen, I was still wired from Brock's fingers on my neck, his low growl replaying like a bet I couldn't cash out. Mom was still off on her sales conference. Her last text is sharp, bet I'd stay out of chaos, not a chance. I wandered into the garage that afternoon, the air thick with steel and pine, where Brock was hunched over a workbench, sharpening a set of throwing knives, his faded flannel open over a tight tee, jeans scuffed, gray stubble catching the light. He'd mentioned his old casino days included odd hobbies, and now he was prepping for a friend's backyard contest. He didn't look up, just slid a blade across the stone, grumbling I'd better not touch, bet I'd cut myself. I grinned, leaned on the bench, my sneakers brushing the concrete near his, flirty, saying he looked hot with a blade, bet he'd throw me sharper. He smirked, tested the edge, and said throws didn't flirt, bet I'd miss the mark. I slid closer, my hip grazing the bench's edge, teasing that missing was my aim, bet he'd hit it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing a knife by my wrist, fingers lingering, and said hitting was my dodge, bet I'd throw him off. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd catch it clean. He smirked, spun a blade, his arm nudging mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this lesson. I grabbed a knife, flirty, twirling it, teasing that owing was my hook, bet he'd teach me with that grin. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying teaching was my bluff, bet I'd nick him first. I laughed, flirty, saying nicking was my kick, bet he'd dodge it anyway. He smirked, set up a wooden target across the garage, muttering dodging was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, stepped up, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd pin it sharp. He showed me the stance, his hand brushing my elbow to adjust my grip, and we started bickering about aim. He swore by wrist flicks. I argued for full arm throws, flirty, saying I'd outshine him, bet I'd stick it first. He laughed, said I'd hit the wall, bet I'd flinch. I tossed, the knife clattering short, and I pouted, flirty, saying he'd jinxed me, bet I'd get him back. He smirked, threw a perfect bullseye, muttering getting was my hustle, bet I'd cost him a blade. I grabbed another, determined, but my foot caught a stray wrench, and I stumbled, the knife slipping from my hand, clanging to the floor. I gasped, laughing, sprawling against the bench, my top shifting. Rock lunged, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me upright, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd wreck his shop. My pulse spiked, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd save it anyway. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing that saving was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd toss it back. We cleaned the mess, knives back on the bench, and I grabbed a rag, wiping the floor, flirty, saying he looked too good sharpening, bet he'd cut my spark. He smirked, took it, his fingers grazing mine, muttering cutting was my chaos, bet I'd nick him worse. I bumped his shoulder, teasing, saying nicking was my rush, bet he'd mend it anyway. The garage hummed, dusk creeping in, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the knife, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd mess him up. I grinned, flirty, saying messing was my bet he'd bite it hard. The tension crackled, blades gleaming, and I knew I'd hooked him, knives sharp, stakes sharper. 4 days after the knife-throwing spark, the Seattle waterfront glowed under a rare sunny afternoon, the air sharp with salt and roasted coffee as I, Emma, 19, lounged at an outdoor cafe table, twirling a straw in an iced latte. Mom was still off on her sales conference, her last text a gruff bet I'd keep things low-key, not even close. I'd been replaying Brock's steady smirks, his firm grip, and they'd sunk deeper than I'd intended. He'd agreed to meet me here, claiming he needed a break from security consulting, and I'd challenged him to a poker game, knowing his casino days made him a shark. He strolled up, a deck of cards in hand, his faded flannel open over a black tee, jeans worn, gray stubble catching the light. He tossed the deck on the table, muttering I'd better not cheat, bet I'd lose my shirt. I grinned, flirty, kicked my chair closer, my sandals brushing his boots, saying he looked hot with cards, bet he'd deal me wild. He smirked, shuffled the deck, and said wild didn't flirt, bet I'd fold in a round. I leaned in, my elbow grazing the table by his arm, teasing that folding was my bluff, bet he'd raise me sharp. He dealt, his hand brushing a chip by my wrist, fingers lingering, and said raising was my dodge, bet I'd throw his hand off. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd play it tight. He smirked, flipped a card, his shoulder nudging mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this pot. I grabbed a chip, flirty, tossing it in, teasing that owing was my hook, bet he'd ante with that grin. He matched it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying anteing was my hustle, bet I'd con him out. I laughed, flirty, saying conning was my kick, bet he'd call it anyway. He smirked, raised the bet, his knee brushing my leg under the table, muttering calling was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, flipped a card, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd deal it sharp, started bickering about strategy, he swore by slow plays. I pushed all in bluffs, flirty, saying I'd outsmart him, bet I'd take the pot. He laughed, said I'd bust, bet I'd bluff my way to broke. I shoved a pile of chips, teasing I'd show him, bet I'd win. He called, flipping a flush, and I groaned all flirty, saying he'd rigged it, I bet I'd get him back. He smirked, leaned in, muttering getting was my chaos, bet I'd cost him more. I grabbed my latte, flirty, but my elbow knocked it, coffee splashing his flannel. I gasped, giggling, snatching a napkin, dabbing his chest, my fingers lingering, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him a shirt. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my tangle, bet I'd stain him worse. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying staining was my thrill, bet he'd wear it anyway. He smirked, took the napkin, his hand grazing my arm, muttering wearing was my snare, bet I'd mess him up. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying messing was my win, bet he'd clean it anyway. The cafe buzzed, gulls crying, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the chips, muttering flaring was my hustle, bet I'd burn this game. The cards scattered, the pot forgotten, and I stood, flirty, saying he looked too good dealing, bet he'd spark my hand. He smirked, gathered the deck, his arm brushing my shoulder, muttering sparking was my trap, bet I'd reel him too far. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying reeling was my bet he'd bite it hard. The waterfront gleamed, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him. He chips down, stakes soaring. 3 days after the waterfront poker game, the Seattle evening was draped in a soft drizzle. The living room flickering with the grainy glow of an old casino movie on the TV, the sound of slot machines and sharp dialogue filling the space. Mom was still off on her sales conference. Her last text a clipped bet I'd keep the house quiet, way off the mark. I'd been savoring Brock's sly grins, his quick grabs, and they dug deeper than I'd expected. I sprawled on the couch, legs kicked over the armrest, sipping a soda, my loose hoodie and shorts slipping as I shifted. Brock came in, a bowl of popcorn in hand, his faded flannel unbuttoned over a dark tee, jeans worn, settling beside me. He tossed the bowl on the coffee table, his fingers brushing my can, muttering I'd better not hog it, bet I'd eat it all. I grinned, flirty, snatched a handful, saying he looked slick with snacks, bet he'd deal me some. He smirked, grabbed the remote, and said snacks didn't flirt, bet I'd talk through the flick. I leaned closer, my elbow nudging his arm, flirty, teasing that talking was my deal, bet he'd watch me anyway. He clicked the volume up, his hand brushing the table by my wrist, teasing, saying watching was my dodge, bet I'd reel him off the plot. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying reeling was my spark, bet he'd play it sharp. He smirked, tossed popcorn at me, his shoulder grazing mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this show. The movie rolled, a heist scene unfolding, and I grabbed the remote, flirty, teasing he'd pick a dud, bet I'd choose better. He lunged for it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying choosing was my bluff, bet I'd ruin it. I yanked back, flirty, and we started wrestling for it, laughing, my hip bumping his as I twisted. He caught my wrist, light, pulling me closer, muttering ruining was my trap, bet I'd hook him silly. I grinned, bumped his chest, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd grab it anyway. The tussle tipped us, and I slid off the couch, landing on the rug with a yelp, giggling, my hoodie shifting. Brock dove, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me up, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd cost him the scene. My pulse spiked, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying costing was my vibe, bet he'd save the movie anyway. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing that saving was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd replay it sharp. We settled back, popcorn scattered, and started bickering about the plot. He swore the heist was slick. I argued it was sloppy, flirty, saying I'd outsmart them, bet I'd win the bet. He laughed, said I'd bust, bet I'd flop in a real game. I grabbed a soda, flirty, but my elbow knocked his can, fizz spilling over the table. I gasped, giggling, snatching a napkin, wiping his sleeve, my fingers lingering, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him a drink. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd soak him worse. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying soaking was my rush, bet he'd drink it anyway. The movie droned, tension humming, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the remote, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd mess him up. I grinned, flirty, saying messing was my bet he'd bite it hard. The night pulsed, popcorn gone, stakes soaring. Mom's return loomed, her conference ending tomorrow. Her last text betting I'd stayed tame, blind to my 2-week spark with Brock in our Seattle home. I craved chaos, coaxing him to a pulsing nightclub, its neon lights flashing. In a tight top and skirt, I dragged him through the crowd, his dark jacket sharp. He grumbled I'd start a riot, bet I'd pull him in. I grinned, a flirty, nudging his arm, saying he looked hot in the glow, bet he'd dance my vibe. The club thumped, strobes blazing, bass shaking. I grabbed a shot, flirty, daring him to match, bet he'd choke. He smirked, downed it, his fingers brushing mine, muttering choking was my trap, bet I'd spin him out. I hit the floor, swaying close, flirty, teasing he'd better move, bet he'd keep up. He stepped in, hands light on my hips, saying keeping was my chaos, bet I'd trip him. I spun, my shoulder grazing his chest, saying tripping was my spark, bet he'd catch it. The crowd roared, and I wobbled, pee falling against him, my hands on his arms, flirty, giggling he looked too good, bet he'd flare. He steadied me, grip warm, teasing flaring was my mess, bet I'd burn this club. I pressed closer, my knee brushing his, saying burning was my rush, bet he'd fan it. Thunder rumbled outside, but I wanted more, hooked tight, dance wild, stakes wilder. The morning after the nightclub chaos, Mom's return from her sales conference was imminent. Her last text to Kurt bet I'd kept things quiet, wildly off. The Seattle sky hung gray, rain tapping the windows, and I, Emma, 19, was restless, the heat of Brock's hands on my hips from the dance floor still burning. I'd pushed too far with him, 58, ex-casino dealer turned security consultant, over 2 weeks, and I wanted one last play before Mom's arrival. I found him in his home office, a cramped room lined with books and old poker chips, where he was sorting files, his faded flannel open over a dark tee, jeans worn, gray stubble sharp. I leaned on the desk, in a hoodie and shorts, flirty, saying he looked hot with papers, bet he'd deal me one last hand. He smirked, pushed the files aside, and said hands didn't flirt, bet I'd fold fast. I slid closer, my hip grazing the desk, teasing that folding was my bluff, bet he'd raise me sharp. He pulled a deck from a drawer, his hand brushing a chip by my wrist, muttering raising was my dodge, bet I'd throw his game. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd play it tight. He dealt a quick round of poker, his arm nudging mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this stack. I tossed a chip, flirty, saying owing was my hook, bet he'd ante with that grin. He matched it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying anteing was my hustle, bet I'd con him out. I grinned, a flirty, saying conning was my kick, bet he'd call it anyway. The game heated, and I upped the stakes, flirty, betting my hoodie, bet he'd blink. He smirked, raised with his cap, tossing it, muttering blinking was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I laughed, leaned in, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd chase it hard. The cards fell, his flush beating my pair, and I groaned, flirty, saying he'd cheated, bet I'd get him back. He smirked, leaned closer, his hand brushing my arm, muttering getting was my chaos, bet I'd cost him more. I stood, bowled off flirty, saying he looked too good winning, bet he'd stake me now. I stepped around the desk, my shoulder grazing his chest, teasing I'd raise him, bet he'd fold. He stood, his hands brushing my waist, light, pulling me closer, his breath sharp, growling folding was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. My pulse raced, and I leaned in, my lips hovering near his, flirty, whispering dragging was my thrill, bet he'd bite it. The rain hammered, and doubt crashed in, this was wrong, a line I couldn't cross. I froze, pulling back, my hands pushing his chest, muttering I can't, bet this was a mistake. He stepped away, hands dropping, stunned, saying mistakes were my deal, bet I'd run now. I shook my head, heart pounding, saying running was right, bet he'd see why. I bolted to my room, the storm raging, and called Mom, spilling everything. 2 weeks of flirting, the line I'd almost crossed. She was livid, saying I'd broken trust, bet I'd regret it. She caught an early flight, landing that night. Mom confronted me in the kitchen, voice sharp, saying she'd heard enough, bet I'd shattered her world. I admitted I'd stopped, bet she'd forgive me. She didn't, ordering me to pack, saying I'd stay with a friend, bet I'd learn. Brock stayed silent, his office door shut, and I left, rain soaking me, knowing I'd lit it, bet it burned me most. The city blurred, my bag heavy, stakes sunk. Mom's return loomed, her conference ending, her last text betting I'd stayed tame, blind to my 2-week spark with Brock, 58, ex-casino dealer, in our Seattle home. Rain lashed the windows, and I, Emma, 19, Found him in his office, sorting files, his flannel open, eyes sharp. I leaned on his desk, flirty, saying he looked hot with papers, bet he'd deal me a hand. He smirked, pulled a deck, muttering hands didn't flirt, bet I'd fold. I slid closer, hip grazing the desk, teasing folding was my bluff, bet he'd raise me, he dealt poker, his hand brushing mine, muttering raising was my trap, bet I'd bust. I tossed a chip, flirty, saying busting was my spark, bet he'd ante up. I bet my scarf, flirty, daring him, bet he'd blink. He tossed his cap, smirking, muttering blinking was my hustle, bet I'd hook him. I leaned in, knee brushing his flirty, whispering hooking was my rush, bet he'd bite. His hand grazed my waist, pulling me close, growling biting was my snare, bet I'd blaze him out, doubt hit hard, this was wrong. I froze, pushing back, muttering I can't, bet it's a mistake. He stepped away, stunned, saying mistakes were my call, bet I'd run. I bolted, heart pounding, and called Mom, confessing everything, flirting, the line I'd stopped at. She was furious, saying I'd broken trust, bet I'd regret it. She flew back, ordering me to a friend's, bet I'd learn. I packed, rain falling, rock silhouette fading, knowing I'd lit it, bet it burned me most.